Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Sniper on the Eastern Front, Chapter 10, Worse Than Hungry Foxes. The German forces now regrouped, integrating Romanian units into their ranks. But the fighting force of their Romanian allies was so low because of their lack of experience and equipment that they brought no lasting relief. The 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division was in a very bad state once again as regards personnel and equipment and could only repair some of the damage by absorbing the scattered units and equipment of dispersed divisions. In addition, more than a third of the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division was transferred just 10 days later, on April the 17th, to support a seriously endangered section of the front, where it was placed under the command of the divisions already posted there. Sepp was lucky to remain with the rest of the division because what was designated Combat Group Rode, of which Gebirgsjäger Regiment 138 was the principal element, subsequently sustained awful losses of more than 800 men. Fate was kind to the rest of the division for a few weeks. May showed itself from its best angle as regards the weather, and in Gebirgsjäger Regiment 144's sector of the front, on the banks of the Dniester, the war seemed to take a break. Their opponents were entrenched within firing range but limited themselves to a loose static fight, which means that they exchanged occasional mortar and machine gun fire and, to relieve the boredom, sent out small patrols from time to time. The river between the adversaries was about 300 or 400 meters wide, and it wasn't possible for the marksmen to creep between the enemy lines and search out good shooting positions. So Sepp toured the positions of his unit daily and confined himself to shooting at special targets pointed out by his comrades. At distances of up to 400 meters, it was art more than accuracy if he managed to hit a head. But logically, he calculated, the demoralizing effect on those who escaped his projectiles by a hair's breadth when they thought themselves at a safe distance would be considerable. The daily routine of warfare seemed to diffuse a soldier's sense of danger. As a rule, he could not look upon his enemy's fire as a direct and personal threat. Only if he was targeted by a single weapon or was involved in single combat man-to-man did he get the feeling of individual menace again, the feeling that they are out to get me. Selective shooting by invisible marksmen scared even the most experienced soldiers. The marksman represented an individualized threat to his life. This explains the amazing impact of such soldiers on the battlefield where, for example, a single marksman could drive an entire company into cover for hours. They would be seized by a kind of psychological paralysis, in which every single man felt individually threatened and feared that the slightest movement would make him the shooter's next victim. Generally, a soldier has to live with the constant awareness of his own vulnerability and potential death. Many fail to bear up under the psychological load, and in action they panic. This showed itself in wild and unaimed shooting and a latent readiness to run away that became uncontrollable as soon as the enemy got closer or the soldier found himself apparently alone. So, resistance to stress is more significant to the quality of a soldier than his shooting skill or technical expertise. Good marksmen are therefore hard to find in peacetime, and the selection and training of future marksmen based on no more than their shooting skills has to be considered a serious mistake. Above all, a marksman has to have a high degree of self-control and strong nerves. Shooting can be learned, particularly as the shooting skills of marksmen are overrated in a military context. The reality of service in the field showed that shooting distances for small arms were 400 meters at most and usually below 200 meters, and if the marksman aimed at the middle of the largest surface, a hit became almost certain. Absolute reliability, methodical routine and sure hits made a marksman, not artistic shots from hundreds of meters away. Such long-distance shots were more like a party trick, if they were successful at all. Sepp made his usual tour through the positions. For days, there had been just insignificant skirmishes with the Russians, who did not dare to leave their positions because they knew there was an expert marksman around. He had spent the whole morning with different machine gun guards and observed the enemy lines without finding a target. In the afternoon, he decided to visit the battalion's northern positions, which he rarely visited because they lay in a very wide curve of the river, so that the Russian positions were more than a kilometer away. No fighting was taking place here apart from occasional and unaimed MG fire, and the distance was far too great for a rifle shot. Among his comrades there was a holiday-like mood. They were enjoying the warm weather, sprawling in the sun shirtless, cracking lice. Some had a wash, using the lid of their mess kit as a bowl. Others even tried to please their own vanity and tried to scratch the skid marks and dried diarrhea from their underpants that had not been washed for weeks, and the heavy, spicy smell of rotten cheese from socks that had been put out to air hung over the whole scene. The mood was so relaxed that Sepp was invited to join in a delicious impromptu snack of hard cookies with artificial marmalade from a tin and ersatz coffee. These luxuries had been liberated by the company's grounger the previous day from the jeep of 2 artillery officers making a brief exploratory reconnaissance. As the rifleman chatted, a machine gun guard who had just been relieved told them about strange sounds coming over from the Russian side of the river. He described them as being like the background noise you hear around a swimming pool. This made Sepp curious, and he decided to investigate. Between their positions and the neighboring company there was a piece of unoccupied ground from which he hoped to get a clear view onto the Russian positions. After he had gone about 500 meters, he found a bushy hill with enough cover to make his observation. Carefully, he crawled through the high grass between 2 bushes, and before him was an astonishing scene. Invisible from the German positions, a small bay in the riverbank was full of Russians enjoying assorted bathing activities. They were obviously feeling very safe. Nobody was guarding them or protecting them. Sepp guessed the distance at about 600 meters. There was no wind and the air was dry. In a mixture of jealous rage at their carelessness, personal ambition to score a hit at this range, and realization that it was essential to show determination to the enemy at every opportunity, the decision to take a shot across the huge distance welled up inside him. He chose a large, very static target. On the embankment of the opposite shore, some Russians were lying together, sunbathing on the sand. Since Sepp was in an elevated shooting position, the soldiers he aimed for presented an almost right-angled shot. With his bayonet, he quickly cut some turfs from the ground and piled them up into a firm and solid gun rest, then aimed above the head of his victim. He breathed a few times slowly and regularly. After a last deep breath, he took the trigger, held his breath, and pulled. The whipping bang destroyed the silence. Bringing his weapon instantly back into position after its momentary recoil, he had its target back in his telescopic sight in a fraction of a second and saw the bullet strike above the navel of the unsuspecting Russian. He doubled up like a jackknife. His cry of pain and the panicked voices of his comrades blew across to Sepp. The fatally injured man rolled over on his side, and a huge pool of blood from his back was apparent in the sand. The other Russians scattered in all directions like chickens startled by a hawk, and nobody dared to help their dying comrade. After a few minutes, his suffering seemed to have ended because his movement ceased. Meanwhile, Sepp saw a rush of activity among uniformed Russians above the riverbank, and moments later he heard the sound of a descending mortar shell that detonated on the shore below him. It was time to get away before things became serious. He wriggled away like a weasel and ran back to the rifleman's trenches, protected by the hill, while shells destroyed the firing positions behind him. The host of the coffee break welcomed him back with a certain spitefulness in his voice. He had heard the single gunshot break the silence of the afternoon and immediately knew what had happened. Shit, was that really necessary? Our coziness has had it. Boys, get into your clothes, Ivan will be giving us hell. Mr. Artful Shooter here couldn't wait to destroy our idyll. He had hardly finished speaking when the first salvos of machine gun fire raked their position, followed by a short mortar strike that landed behind the trenches without doing any damage. Sepp used the sudden activity to slip away gracefully and not expose himself to any further invective. The next day, singular, dangerously precise shots began hitting the 2nd Battalion's position, a clear indication that a specialist on the Russian side was taking on the problem of Sepp Allerberger. But Sepp stayed quite calm, because a duel across the river was not possible. Of course, he did start to double his attention. It was amazing how quickly soldiers settled into a position and made it cozy. Their few weeks in that place resulted in encampments like self-contained villages. As if out of nowhere, they created every possible sort of utility. They built laundries and barber salons and showers. They cooked and fried and organized meals. There were even chickens around, which were guarded with their keepers' lives as a tasty source of roast meals and eggs. But the soldiers were worse than hungry foxes, and successful chicken thieves were held in great esteem by their comrades. Sepp and the battalion runners with whom he worked had no such opportunities to cultivate a camp life. They were therefore dependent on ruthless theft in order to get a varied and mixed diet, and realizing this, their comrades watched them carefully. But it was just a question of days before they set to work. Because Sepp could freely move about the battalion area, he was the one to track down potential victims. The sergeant of the neighboring company had a real humdinger of a chicken, lovingly called Josephine, which supplied him with an egg a day because he took such good care of it. This he ate himself or traded for other delicacies. A single chicken was an ideal target because if Sepp acted skillfully, there was no danger of being betrayed by the screams of other birds. Being a specialist and marksman, Sepp was unanimously chosen as the assassin. "Sepp, this is clearly a job for a marksman. Your hunting instincts and your cat-like smoothness make you the obvious choice." It was a new moon and the sky was cloudy, ideal conditions for a commando operation of this delicate kind. While his comrades made a fire and readied everything for swift and smooth preparation of their meal, Sepp put on full camouflage for the first and last time. He blackened his face and hands with charcoal and tied branches onto his hat and uniform. Lightly rustling in the wind, he disappeared into the darkness, although not without first asking a comrade who'd been a farmer about the quickest way of liquidating a chicken with one's bare hands. Like a panther, he crept carefully and silently into the dugouts of the neighboring company. The chicken was dozing unsuspectingly in its usual hiding place, lovingly made out of wicker baskets intended for artillery ammunition. The guard was standing about 20 meters away, sharing a cigarette with a comrade, which they smoked behind a helmet in order not to reveal themselves by the glow. Sepp's nerves tightened. He knew that he'd suffer if he was caught. Now he was at the wicker basket. He hardly dared to breathe, and his pounding heart was almost bursting as he raised the lid of the basket millimeter by millimeter. There was the chicken, with its head under its wing, in deep sleep. Now was not the time for mistakes. He leaned the basket lid against his forehead to have both hands free. His hands approached the chicken. Only a few centimeters left, and then he had a grip on its neck with his left hand. At the same moment, he managed to take the chicken's rising head in its right hand, and before it knew what was happening, a short, energetic twist of his hands ended Josephine's life with a silent crack. Sepp remained still for a moment to observe the guard, but he just continued whispering to his comrade and clearly hadn't noticed anything. Quickly, Sepp stowed the chicken away inside his camouflage jacket and disappeared as silently as he had come. A quarter of an hour later, the chicken was plucked and drawn, and all traces of its demise were buried far away. Another hour passed, and it was braced and divided up onto 4 mess tins, a banquet for Sepp and his comrades. To mark the occasion, they washed it down with a bottle of schnapps. Full and drunk, they fell into a well-deserved and restful sleep, from which they were torn by the screams of the bereaved sergeant the next morning. "What dirty pig has stolen my chicken? It can only be one of your company. The tracks of the assassin are leading in your direction. Not one of my men would have dared to touch Josephine. I'd have shoot him personally." Sepp and his comrades struggled to look surprised and shocked, and obviously succeeded because they got away with it, even though the sergeant showed that he clearly suspected them. He had no proof, but he promised to keep at it, and if he should find any, he threatened he'd have them court-martialed and shot as looters. Between May the 25th and May the 28th, the battalion's tranquility was ended, but only for a short while. The survivors of Gebirgsjäger Regiment 138 returned, and the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division was transferred to the Aurel Pass in the Carpathian Mountains. Their positions followed the course of the Moldau, which was now between them and the Russian front. Besides this watery obstacle, the forested approaches of the slowly rising mountains were good cover for the riflemen. The terrain lying before them on the other side of the river was very open, flat and highly visible. Fate was good to the division, for the Russian focus of attack was transferred to a place north of their positions, and they had only light skirmishes with the enemy. Along with really beautiful weather, this unexpected rest and peace provided the exhausted riflemen with an opportunity to recuperate. Quickly their camp life was re-established. Homely bunkers were created, and everything was organized to make life as pleasant as possible. The Lancers were electrified when the latrine patrol told them that a Wehrmacht brothel was about to be transferred to their quiet sector for 2 weeks for edification and for psychosexual reasons. War reduced a soldier's life to the absolutely essential things: survival, scoffing, guzzling, and, if possible, fucking. The last, of course, was only possible, other than by rape, which was not to everybody's taste and was often punished, if troops were in a relatively peaceful situation and could fraternize with the native population, or if there was a brothel in the neighborhood. When a unit was able to relax, the strain of constant fighting often unloaded itself in the form of an overpowering sexual drive. Relief from this urge assumed very high importance, simply in order to maintain discipline. While officers and sergeants helped themselves to female Wehrmacht helpers, called officers' mattresses in Lancer slang, the lowly military rank of a Lancer meant he did not have access to such women. For him, there was just rape or the brothel. When the opportunity presented itself, the latter establishments were stormed by the sex-stuffed soldiers. But their visits presented one little problem. They were observed by medical personnel and ended with disinfection in order to prevent venereal disease. More than a few soldiers deliberately infected themselves with these diseases so as to get away from the front. In order to treat them, special hospitals were eventually established, called knights' castles among the Lancers, where their syphilis was dealt with using sometimes very rough methods of treatment. Usually a stay in a knight's castle was enough to encourage the exercise of sexual discipline in the future. Experts on the subject still remember the Dittelstab with little rapture. This was a kind of round file used to open encrusted focuses of disease inside the urethra to be disinfected later. This was done without anesthetic, of course. Moreover, repeatedly infected soldiers were subjected to disciplinary punishments as early as the first years of the war on the grounds of their disease being a form of self-mutilation. The strict disinfection of brothel visitors' urethras theoretically prevented problems. Lancers experienced with what might be termed commercial favors knew the details of this procedure and had great fun regaling younger comrades with their incisive experiences. But in the innocence of his years, Sepp foresaw none of it. During this period of rest, Sepp met his marksman comrade Josef again. They exchanged ideas, drank, and talked about sex. Being young, neither of them had much experience of the opposite sex, but faced with the immediate temptation of the brothel, they discussed the pros and cons of visiting it to find out what they had been missing. After all, it might be the last chance they had for such things. Finally, they came to a conclusion. Now or never, before it was too late. Josef likened the delicate matter to a question of fate. Think of it. Perhaps it's your last opportunity to put one away. Maybe tomorrow you catch one and die without having fucked. What a terrible fate, no? While they were talking, Sepp's eyes fell on the sergeant major from the detachment that had just brought up ammunition, who was sitting on the running board of an Opel Blitz waiting for a load to take back. It was the Viking with the red mustache. He caught Sepp's look and had obviously heard their talk. "Hey, you horny bastards, you get a hard-on thinking of firm butts, haha!" Regaining his composure and seeing their surprised faces, he added, "Honestly, boys, let it be and profit from the life experiences of an old sergeant. The 5 minutes of fun don't make up for the pain afterwards. Trust me." There was a meaningful silence afterwards, interrupted by Roth, now a bit drunk, saying, "Perhaps, you clever dick, you'll tell us your great secret." "Well," the Viking continued, "as a future academic, I'll let you profit from my experience. And if you're good and listen to Uncle, you can spare yourself a lot of trouble." "Don't be such a melodramatic. Fire away," griped Roth. "Okay, a bit of cynicism has to be allowed," the sergeant relented. "First, give me a swig of your gut rot." After swallowing deeply, he started his story with a satisfied sigh. "Well, it was a while ago now. When I had to go to the Corps depot one time, my co-driver was a sergeant, a real cunning old devil, I'll tell you. For the whole ride, he just talked about sex and food. He was totally showing off what he had fingered and where he had screwed. Once we arrived at the depot, he, of course, knew where he could get it. What can I say? He dragged me along to the next brothel. I didn't want to look like I was scared. First we drank, and then we stuck in. The brothel was in a former school. We'd hardly opened the door when a medical sergeant grabbed us by the scruffs of our necks. I tell you, he was a great hulking brute. Immediately, he yelled at us. "Where's your condom?" Surprised, I looked at him. He grinned back and rummaged in his pocket. "The condom, you housewives. No one fights with a blank weapon here," he added. I hadn't thought of that, but for the trivial sum of 30 Pfennig, I could have a Wehrmacht condom. "Fucking twice without any extras? That'll be 5 marks a fuck." Catching my uncomprehending look, he added, "Yes, 5 Reichsmarks, you ferrets." I'd been there a minute and I was already disillusioned. But a real Gebirgsjäger never gives up in the face of adverse circumstances. I paid the medic and he gave me a brown paper bag with the condom. Then he said, "The chickens are over there in the classroom." And with these words he pushed us into the next room. Before us, 5 lightly dressed Romanian women lounged on worn-out upholstery, looking bored as we timidly entered. Quickly, my comrade grabbed a madam and disappeared behind a curtain with her, and probably he was already at work while I stood there like a water in a curve. My erotic desires were there in front of me and I couldn't even move. Now it had got serious. I would have left if I could. I stood there paralyzed, my face reddening. Meanwhile, the women were talking among themselves, deciding who should take care of this stripling. Finally, one of them got up, took my hand without any further comment, and led me behind another curtain. Very excited, I didn't notice the plainness of this love nest as my companion opened my trousers and they dropped to my ankles. It was like being struck by electricity when she took it with a firm but tender grip. I have to decorate the following to torment you virgins a bit. With a theatrical gesture, the Viking assumed a conspiratorial expression, and Sepp and Roth hung on every word of his detailed description of what followed. "Attention, children," he continued. "The little girl who made a pass at me was looking really delicious, and she knew her business. Shh, trust me," she cooed, grabbing my loins, and then she started to caress me rhythmically with both hands. Shudders of lust took me. I pulled her face towards me and covered it with kisses. She let me do it, knowing my youth and naivety. Greedily I sucked in the smell of her body and her hair, my hands losing themselves in the silky shimmering black hair that flowed over her shoulders like silk. Greedily my hands followed the shape of her body. The fear, strain and desire of the last few months, of my entire life, were concentrated in this one moment. Her breath tickled my ears almost unbearably. Tenderly her tongue followed the shape of my neck, nibblingly caressed my earlobe, and whooshed lightly across my throat, touching my cheeks, and inspired by my desire, her hands began to move faster. Shuddering in pleasure, I sank onto the mattress of the floor and gave myself over to the ecstasy of the moment. Supposedly tender embraces give you a misleading feeling of security in the cold of these troubled times, letting you fall but being caught in the moment. Like a beetle, her tongue tickled across my stomach, circling my navel, sweeping across my shame and clasping my holy of holies. The happiness of the moment sent shivers of excitement and warmth. The cruelty of war faded for a few minutes. My body wound round and cuddled up to the strange but familiar moment. My grasping hands and her firm but tender fingers found each other to embrace and hold for that brief instant. My tenderness sought in her face for a moment of fulfillment, but I found myself looking into eyes filled with inscrutable and empty sadness. They cut me off and sent me on a voyage of lonely introspection. Fate or destiny, I don't know. Happiness and pain are the iron elements of fate. Greedily I devoured the fleeting moment of happiness until pain determined reality again. Sepp and Roth sat there with mouths agape, speechless at this almost lyrical interlude. "Man, are you some kind of poet or something?" Roth grumbled. "Can you just tell us what happened?" "Oh, the gentleman wanted a bit simpler, for proles," said the Viking, his poetic flow disrupted. "So, if you want to make notes, the girl gave me such a head that my balls were almost bursting. Do you understand now?" "All right, old man," Sepp calmed him down. "I am enjoying the story. Go on, we shut up." With that, he elbowed Roth on the ribs. "Okay," said the Viking, and he started again. With glazed eyes, relieved, and with a new self-image of myself as a man, I emerged from the shabby cubicle. I bounced light-footedly towards the exit, only to be torn back to reality by the strident voice of the ambulance sergeant. "Not so fast. First come here, down your pants." At first, I again failed to understand what was required because of the medic's northern slang. He came from Münster, in Westphalia. "Just to clean your dick isn't enough," he said more intelligibly. "We gotta try the chemical mace. So, don't be shy, show your noodle." He had already pulled me over and grabbed my holiest with the routine of a butcher. Quick as lightning, he pushed the syringe without a needle into my urethra and injected about 100 milliliters of a green liquid into me. Burning, fiery hot, it shot into my belly as the disinfectant solution cleared a path into my bladder. Grinding my teeth, and with my fists drenched so tightly that my knuckles went white, I endured my martyrdom, unable to defend myself because the medic's iron grip tolerated no contradiction. "That hurts, eh?" said the representative of military healthcare, enjoying my painful desperation. The sensual pleasure of the previous half hour was swept away. "Put your noodle away," the medic bawled at me. "In 5 minutes you may piss, but not a second earlier." My sergeant, the old bastard, had the total routine down pat. He took it like it was nothing. I can still see the fat gloating grin on his face while he watched me doubled up in pain. Observed by a severe sanitary lance corporal, I hopped back and forth in front of the former schoolboy's toilet, my little sausage pinched between thumb and forefinger. I suspect that the vindictive sanitary guy stretched the time out, seeing my pain, until the words, "Now you may," released me. With ecstatic rapture, I gave the sulfonamide solution its well-earned freedom. The feeling of relief was almost orgasmic and nearly better than the joy of my sexual fulfillment. In the meantime, my sergeant couldn't hold back his laughter. After a last inspection of my genitals, I was finally allowed to leave that hospitable place. I staggered back to freedom and swore never again to have sex under such circumstances. After this dramatic description, the two sexually motivated aspirants felt a violent burning in their pants just from listening. I usually prefer to learn from my own experience, Roth commented, but in this case, I listened to the good uncle. Sepp, our action is postponed. Sepp was quite happy about that because he had been too enthusiastic even before the Viking told his tale. He resisted all temptation of this kind until they returned to their homeland. Meanwhile, it seemed that miracles still occurred occasionally. The division was re-equipped unexpectedly back to its full wartime strength of men and material. The officers knew this would be the last time though, because among them it was already acknowledged that the war was lost. They were motivated by just one thought: to deter the Russians from taking revenge on their homeland. The Russians were gathering for a new strike against a few German and Romanian units before them. The lull before the oncoming storm would be the final chance for the division's few remaining old hands who had survived the murderous battles more or less unhurt to see their families one last time. As far as possible, they were given leave. Sepp, even after just 1 year with the division, counted among those who had survived a long time, but at only 19.5 years of age, he had to give way to fathers and men who had served for even longer. In addition, the few experienced marksmen were indispensable. Sepp's chances of a holiday were nil. But his battalion commander, Captain Kloss, who liked him very much, knew a little trick that would get him home. Well, I am back from my vacation in Sicily and I bring you another episode. This one is on another level since I am pretty sure you've never heard about a sulfonamide injection in this level of detail. And yes, the Wehrmacht did indeed issue condoms to prevent the spread of venereal diseases. Another thing I want to talk about is what is referred to as the company scrounger. He only gets mentioned once in passing, but this is something that is common to all armies, I'm sure. And I'm also sure you know the type. It's someone that can get anything from anywhere at any time. I don't know how they do it. Maybe they possess the ability to spawn items at will, but I also had someone like that in my platoon and later, of course, in my company. It was a master sergeant that could provide anything, and he indeed was the one that provided the sex toys we placed at the OPFOR HQ during the Commando night raid I talked about in an earlier after-action report. You know the one I'm talking about, where said sergeant and myself took all the maps and replaced the board markers with dildos. Anyway, I admire the resourcefulness of this type of person. You could be stationed in Antarctica and tell him, listen, Sergeant, some guys from battalion are coming next month and I need something big to demonstrate some things. Something like a giraffe. And he would go, right on, sir. And 2 weeks later, not one, but 2 giraffes would suddenly appear in the mess hall as if nothing has happened. But I digress. Thank you for watching, consider subscribing and tell me your company scrounger stories down in the comments. See you next time. Cheers.